About an hour.
Yeah. Got a little feedback.
Still got some feedback up here.
It's just the bass though, so it's okay.
Okay, that's good. Okay, testing. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you fine. But I'm on the front row.
Yeah, that doesn't count. Okay, well, let's get started. All right. So today we're going to be talking about the archaeology of Jesus' earthly ministry. So real quick, in case anybody's missed the previous lectures, a little bit about my background. I'm a doctoral candidate in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, and I have a background in biblical studies and history. And so I've been kind of doing this series to provide the historical and archaeological context to the Bible. So I'm going to do a real brief recap of some of what I covered last lecture. I think we're getting a little bit of feedback still. Now you may remember from last time that Judah was part of the Roman Empire during this time, and it had been for some time. And prior to that, it had somewhat briefly been an independent kingdom after they had gained their independence from the Greek Empire. And so that's fairly important for understanding the first century society. Now, within Judah, there were various social and religious and ethnic groups that all kind of competed with one another and collaborated with one another as part of that society. So you're probably familiar with many of these, maybe all of them. The Pharisees are probably the most closely associated with synagogue Judaism. And Jesus and many of the apostles are probably ideologically the closest to that group, even though they conflicted with them at various times. There's also the Sadducees that are the more conservative traditionalist group, and they're probably more associated with temple worship. Now, both of those groups collaborated to some extent with the Romans. They accepted that the Romans were part of the society, and they did their best to work within the structure of the Roman Empire. The other two groups did not. So the Essenes were a separatist group. They moved out to the Judean desert right by the Dead Sea and had something like a monastery, or maybe something like a doomsday cult, depending on how sympathetic you were with them. And then there were also the Zealots, and now they lived within Judean society, but they were radically opposed to Roman rule. And so they wanted to rise up and overthrow the Romans just like their ancestors had risen up and overthrown the Greeks. Judas Iscariot may well have been a zealot, because Iscariot sounds a lot like Sicarii, which is one of the groups within the Zealots. And that was a reference to the long knives they carried that were used to assassinate Roman officials. So they were not messing around, and they were probably the group that the Romans were the most nervous about. There's also the Samaritans, which is made up of the people who stayed in the land during the Babylonian exile. And so they'll also show up in the the gospel story several times. Okay, that's enough to go on. If you want to know more, you can go back and watch my previous talk where I go into a bit more detail. So now let's talk about Jesus' life in this context. One of the earliest accounts of his ministry is when Jesus was 12 years old and he visited his family for the Passover festival, or visited Jerusalem with his family. And you may remember that he got so wrapped up talking to the elders in the temple that he got left behind and they had to come back and look for him. So let's talk a little bit about the Jerusalem that he would have known. The picture here is a reconstruction of Herod's temple, which had just been completed not very long before this time, and it was a wonder of the ancient world. They hadn't had anything like this since Solomon's temple was destroyed. And so much of the action in Jerusalem focused around this temple. Now, today, of course, it's completely gone. And this is the western wall of the ancient temple, also called the Wailing Wall, where many Jews and some pilgrims of other faiths will come and lament the destruction of the temple. That's one of the few parts of Herod's temple that is still left accessible. That wall is part of the retaining wall of the podium that the ancient temple was built on. And of course, now the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and now the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are built on the ancient Temple Mount. So close to there, not on the Temple Mount, but just at the base of the western wall, close to the Wailing Wall, they have been able to excavate. And one of the things they found was several of these, what are called mikvaot, ritual baths. So ritual purity was a really big deal in Jewish temple culture. And these are subterranean mikvaot, where they're hewn out of the rock, and you have the set of steps with a divider in the middle, and you'd go down one side, ritually bathe in the water that's at the bottom, and then you'd go back up the other side, ritually pure, and then able to approach the temple. And that's almost certainly where our doctrine of baptism came from. It grew out of that tradition. Now, I think I mentioned that the Temple Mount itself is completely inaccessible to archaeology due to the presence of the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But back in 1999, there were construction projects going on the Temple Mount, and as part of that, they pushed a large amount of soil off the side of it. And ever since then, there's been an ongoing project to sift through all that soil and see what they can find in it. And so that's the closest thing we currently have to being able to excavate the Temple Mount proper. It's very limited. You don't have context the way you do in a conventional archaeological dig, but anything that you can access from the Temple Mount is hugely important for the archaeology of this period. I'm going to show you a few of the things they found. On the left here is a half shekel coin, which was the coin that was used for the temple tax. So they found several of those. They also found many Roman lepton coins. This was the smallest coin that circulated during this period. And this is the coin referenced in the story of the widow's mite. When you have the rich men who are giving out of their abundance, but this poor widow gives this little bitty coin that in God's eyes is greater than all those riches because she gave out of her poverty. I have one of those that you can look at up here if you want to come up after the talk. So they found a lot of those. They also found a small gold bell that some people think might have been sewn into the fringes of the high priest's garment. In Exodus 28, when it goes through all the trappings of temple worship, one of the things that is prescribed is that the high priest's fringe would have bells sewn into it. And so it's just possible that this little bell was one of those. Now, I always caution about linking anything we find archaeologically directly with the Bible. You can come up with any number of ways that a little bell could have wound up on the Temple Mount. I'm certainly not confident that it belonged to the high priest's robes, but it's possible, and some people have just naturally associated it with that passage, which that could have been where it came from. Now they've also found a whole bunch of these little mosaic-type tile pieces. Now this came from a style of mosaic tile called opus sectile, which was common in the Roman period. And they're probably from the floor tiles of Herod's temple. And so on the left there, you can see examples of the actual small tile pieces. And then on the right are reconstructions of that style of tile work. And so probably the temple courts were decorated in that type of tile work, and that's where these pieces came from in the sifting. Now, another detail from Jerusalem is there are these beautiful, elaborate carved tombs which are visible. I think they're visible from certain parts of the Temple Mount itself. I think if you're on the southeast corner, you would be able to see these. Certainly anybody in Jerusalem at the time would have been familiar with these. And they're still there. You can go right up to them now and explore in there. But probably when Jesus compared the Pharisees to whitewashed tombs and accused them of hypocrisy, he probably had these in mind. He was probably using that as an object, because frequently Jesus seems to have drawn object lessons from things that he and the people around him encountered in ordinary life. I'll talk about a couple of other examples of that as later in this talk. But that's one. He almost certainly was alluding to these tombs. So now we'll go back to Jesus' early ministry, and after he visits Jerusalem with his family, they return to the Galilee, to Nazareth, and early in his ministry, we have this account of Jesus speaking in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he starts to allude to his identity as the Messiah. And the congregation catches on to it, and they're mortified. You know, it sounds like he's speaking blasphemy. And they take him and try to throw him off a cliff. Like, they're so offended at his apparent blasphemy that they're going to throw him off a cliff, presumably to his death. And a lot of people think that this cliff that I'm standing on in this picture is the cliff. This is close to Nazareth, and this overlooks the Megiddo Valley, and so it's a very significant drop. I can't remember what. I certainly wouldn't want to jump off of it. But of course, Jesus miraculously slips away from the crowd, and that kind of sets a pattern of him coming into conflict with the other religious leaders of his day. But this is another spot that you can visit and just kind of get a feel for the lay of the land and the sort of things that he would have seen. Now, after declaring himself to the congregation in Nazareth, he moves on to the Upper Galilee, around the actual Sea of Galilee. So Judah kind of steps up from south to north. Jerusalem itself is high because it's in the hills, but that part of the country is quite a bit lower than the lower Galilee, and then geologically above that is the Upper Galilee, where the actual sea is, and then that all flows down into the Dead Sea. So Jesus shifts his ministry up to the Galilee region, and then that's kind of home base for a long time. So we have many accounts from the Gospels that take place in this region. And the Sea of Galilee is one of those things that is probably not what you're picturing, unless you've been there or you've seen a documentary about it. I know when I was younger and I was hearing the accounts of it, I pictured this huge sea. Like, I grew up close to the Great Lakes. I figured it was at least that big, a body of water that you couldn't see across. But it's not. It's fairly small. So here, it's about 13 by 8 miles, which sounds pretty big, but for a sea, it's really quite small. This is a picture I took from the Horns of Hattim, which is a hill on the west bank of the Sea of Galilee. It's actually a defunct volcano, and it's called the Horns of Hattim because from a distance it looks like two horns, like of a bull or a bovine, and that's the crater of this defunct volcano. You can climb up there, and you can actually, from a distance, you can get the whole sea in your field of vision, which is kind of wild. I was a bit surprised to discover that. So it's really quite a small region, considering how momentously important it is to the gospel story. Also, the Horns of Hattim, this hill, was the location of an important battle in the Crusades. So that's not pertinent to this talk, but it's just kind of an interesting detail. And if you have an interest in that period, you might look that up. Here's another view of the sea looking north to south. So the land continues to rise up. So as you proceed north, you can get another really good view of the sea, and you get the whole thing in your vision at once. Now, one of the important locations in Jesus' ministry around the Galilee is Capernaum. That comes up several times throughout the gospel narratives, and it's kind of home base to Jesus and the apostles, and that's a really cool little site. The picture here, that's me the first time I went to Israel, at the synagogue at Capernaum. So I'll talk about that a little bit later and show you better pictures, but that was a fun memory. Now, much of the village was preserved and has been excavated, and you can visit there and walk around it, see where the main road would have been, see many of the houses, some of which dated clear back to the time of the Gospels. Now, here again is that synagogue. It's beautifully preserved. Now, it's a bit later than Jesus' time. I think it was built in the 3rd or 4th century. So this wouldn't have been the synagogue that Jesus and the apostles worshipped in, but it was built over an earlier synagogue that almost certainly was the synagogue of Jesus and the apostles. So it's really cool to have that continuity, that even though this isn't the synagogue that they worshiped in, it's pretty close. And it's really cool that you can go and actually walk around in a synagogue that's in the exact same location as the one where Jesus and the apostles would have been. And right down the street from that is a very early church built over the ruins of a 1st century house. And that is believed to have been Peter's house, or possibly Peter's mother's house, but that is believed to have been the house that Jesus and the apostles would have congregated around. That was probably kind of home base for them. They probably stayed there when they were in this town. On the right, you can see the ruins of that church and the house in the center. And then on the left, you see what looks like the Millennium Falcon that landed on top of it. And what that is the modern church. And it's really cool. It's hideous. It's this hideous concrete pancake that looks like the Millennium Falcon, but the intention behind it was really neat, in that with many churches in the Holy Land, they're beautiful, but you often can't see the thing that they're meant to preserve and commemorate. So if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which we'll talk about next week, or if you go to the Church of the Nativity, which we talked about last time, you can't see much of what was there in ancient times. It's all covered in marble and gilding and tapestries and beautiful, but you can't actually see much there. And so with this church, they decided to not do that. They built it on pylons, like legs, so the whole thing is elevated off the ground. So rather than encasing the ancient ruins and which would have preserved it, but would have meant that nobody can view it, instead of doing that, they built this church elevated above the ruins, and there's a glass floor in the middle where you can still look down and see the ancient church under the modern one. So it's really a cool idea. Something else that comes up repeatedly during this part of Jesus' ministry is boats and the water Several of the apostles were fishermen, and so many of these narratives take place on and around the water and on and around boats. And this is a boat that is sometimes called the Jesus boat. Almost certainly not Jesus' actual boat or a boat that Jesus actually sailed on. But from roughly the same time, this boat was found back in the late 80s, I believe, sunk in shallow water on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And it's almost completely preserved. And it was probably sunk during the Jewish wars with Rome, which culminated in the destruction of the temple. And that took place a few decades after Jesus' earthly ministry. But it would have been kind of an old boat, but it's possible that it was that this actual boat was around at the time of Jesus. And very likely this was the sort of boat that they would have sailed in. And rather like the sea itself, the boat is a lot less impressive than I would have thought. It's basically a very large canoe. When I heard stories about the sea in Sunday school, Jesus calming the waves, walking on the water, all these things, I pictured them in like a small ship, like something with a deck, maybe multiple masts, something fairly substantial. But this is, like I say, more like a very large canoe. It's about 27 feet long and 7.5 feet wide. And this is a reconstruction of what we think it would have looked like when it was new. So it looks like something in between a canoe and like a Viking boat. But a fairly small little utilitarian boat that would have fit maybe a dozen people, or more likely probably a crew of 3 to 5 guys and their fishing gear and their catch. But that's just another cool little detail that kind of grounds you in this ancient world and reminds us that it was a real place and a real time. And it might not have been exactly what we pictured, but it was, these were still stories about real people and real lives. Now, after Jesus' ministry around the Galilee, he and the apostles go up to Caesarea Philippi, which is north of the sea, one of the northernmost towns in the region. It's close to Dan, which was an Old Testament town, but you may have heard the phrase from Dan to Beersheba, which refers to the whole land of ancient Israel. And so Caesarea is up in that region. As you might guess from the name Caesarea, it was not a traditional Jewish town. This was a Roman-style town. And it's interesting that Jesus chose this place to bring the apostles, because this is where Jesus declares that Peter is the rock on which he would build his church. You're probably aware that in Greek, Peter is Petros, which means rock, so that was a bit of a play on words there. But Jesus tells Peter that he'll be the rock on which he builds his church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And at Caesarea Philippi, there's a cave called Pan's Grotto, or the Cave of Pan. And that's what you see behind me and my friends here. And that was traditionally believed to have been an entrance to the underworld, like a hell gate. And so, almost certainly, when Jesus chose to have that talk in this place, he was alluding to that tradition. So again, Jesus plays on words and experiences that people would have been familiar with around him. And I think that's fascinating that he chose this little Roman-style town with this cave that was associated with paganism and with dark forces, and that's where Jesus chose to exalt Peter and establish his church. And I think he knew that was a foreshadowing of what would come, that soon the gospel would spread to all the nations, spread throughout the Roman Empire, and the empire would not overcome it, but would be overcome by it. And so I think Jesus chose this place and this imagery for exactly that reason. There are a lot of other things to see at Caesarea. There's this whole little cultic area. So on the left, you can see a little temple that was built in front of that cave mouth, and then there were several other religious structures. So would have been a very strong image of pagan religious power that Jesus was consciously setting himself and the apostles against. There was probably also a temple to Caesar built by Herod the Great here, although we're not entirely sure which structure that is. But that's where the name Caesarea comes from. So after this, Jesus takes the apostles up on a high mountain, and that's where he's transfigured. And if any of the apostles doubted that he was the Messiah before this, this must have removed all doubt, because this is when he really proclaims himself as the Messiah. And we don't know for sure which mountain that was, but I think it was Mount Hermon, which you can see behind us in this picture. This was me and some of my colleagues at Avel Beit Ma'acha, which is an ancient city close to Caesarea Philippi. And I excavated there for several seasons. And every morning you would see the sun rise over the Hermon Range. So where you see those rays of sunshine peeking through the clouds, that's Mount Hermon. And I think that was the Mount of Transfiguration. So here's a view from that mountain. And this guy is looking west towards the Mediterranean coast, but you could also look south, and on a clear day you could have seen well down into the lower Galilee, possibly even down to Judea, and would have been able to look out over the whole land. And that's why I think that this was the Mount of Transfiguration. There's another possible candidate. There's a mountain west of the Sea of Galilee that some people point to as possibly being the Mount of Transfiguration. But if that's the case, they would have had to go all the way south of Capernaum, and then back to Capernaum to proceed on to Jerusalem. That just doesn't make sense to me. Mount Hermon was closer. It's roughly between Caesarea Philippi and Damascus. And I think Jesus chose this as the Mount of Transfiguration as a sign of his sovereignty, because Jesus was not just the Messiah, he was the rightful heir of David, the rightful king of Judea. And if you ever read stories about ancient kings, one of the things they do to demonstrate their sovereignty is they'll ride or walk their entire kingdom and demonstrate their sovereignty by traveling through their kingdom, interacting with their people, showing themselves to their people. And I think that's what Jesus was doing here, because he goes, if I'm right that Mount Hermon is the Mount of Transfiguration, he starts there and then proceeds south, stopping back in Capernaum, which you'll remember is kind of home base, and then continues south on the eastern bank of the Jordan River, before passing through Jericho and then up the road to Jerusalem, on their way to Passover. And so I think that was an intentional act of sovereignty on Jesus' part to reveal himself as the rightful king of Judah. And there are several accounts during this journey of him interacting with people in the various places that he travels through to get from the Upper Galilee to Jerusalem. Another interesting little detail is the road from Jericho to Jerusalem is the setting of the story of the Good Samaritan. And so again, with Jesus drawing on real places and real things that people would have been familiar with, many of the pilgrims in Jerusalem for Passover would have traveled that road, and it would have been very fresh in their memory as a place that you do not want to get in trouble. It's this stark, rocky, craggy country. Kind of reminds me of our Badlands, if you've ever been there. Not a place that you can really live. It's a place for shepherds and bandits and travelers who don't want to stick around. And so I think it's interesting that Jesus clearly walked that path and was familiar with it, and he drew on that imagery in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So I just think that's cool, and another element that just kind of grounds you in that world. So when they arrive in Jerusalem, we have the triumphal entry of the city, where Jesus enters the city and the crowds proclaim Hosanna. He passes near the Mount of Olives, and then I think he must have entered the city through the Golden Gate. And I've read that this is where the sacrificial Passover lambs would be led into the city to the temple. This is the gate closest to the temple, on the east side. And so that was another important piece of imagery that pointed towards Jesus' role as not only king and not only Messiah, but the eternal Passover lamb who would redeem our sins once and for all. Now, this isn't the golden gate that Jesus would have walked through. We don't actually know how old this current gate is or who built it, because it's immediately adjacent to the Temple Mount, and it's never been accessible to archaeologists. And the best guess that many people have that sounds right to me is that Emperor Justinian conducted several building projects in Jerusalem. I think it was around 520. And a lot of people think that Justinian built this gate that replaced the original Golden Gate, which Herod built, which Jesus passed through. And that gate was probably destroyed by the Romans when they wrecked the temple after the Jewish revolt. But this gives you an idea of kind of the location and scale of it. So after entering the city, of course, there are several important encounters in the gospel narratives, but I'm going to skip forward to the Last Supper. And this is a chapel in Jerusalem that many people believe is the upper room where the Last Supper actually took place. And you can still visit there. And so, again, it's just kind of an interesting link to the ancient world that you can still visit and experience. So, after the Last Supper, Jesus and the apostles returned to the Garden of Gethsemane. And interestingly, there's still an ancient olive grove at this garden. And you can't date olive trees by tree rings the way you can some other trees, so we can't know for sure how old these olive trees are, but many of them are clearly extremely ancient, and it seems just possible, at least, that one of these ancient trees might have been a seedling at the time that Jesus came there with the apostles and prayed while he was being betrayed by Judas. And so again, it's just a fascinating link between that ancient world and ours that you can still visit. So then Jesus is taken captive in the garden, and just prior to this, he had revealed to Peter that Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed, and of course he insisted that he wouldn't, but he did, and today there's a church called the Church of Gallicantu, the Church of the Rooster Crowing, that commemorates that story. And the church itself, I don't think it's terribly old. It's certainly not ancient. But under the church is this cellar that some people have suggested could have been a dungeon, and there's sort of a stone ring carved into one of the walls that some people have suggested that a person could be tied to, and it's possible that this was where Jesus was held captive prior to his trial before Pilate. So another place that you can go and physically visit that that may have a direct link to the gospel time. So after being held captive, Jesus is taken before Pilate to be tried. And Pilate was the Roman military governor of Judea. He was the highest civil authority. And we actually have this inscription that mentions him directly. It was found in Caesarea Maritima, not to be confused with the Caesarea we were just talking about, Caesarea Philippi. This Caesarea is on the coast and is one of the cities that Herod built, and he built this to honor the emperor. And it's a thoroughly Roman city. You can see on the left there the ruins of it. There was a hippodrome, a horse racing track. There was an amphitheater that is actually still so intact that they continue to use it as a theater to this day. So that's really cool. You can visit that. Herod also had a palace here. But during the excavations of this city, they encountered this inscription which mentioned Pontius Pilate. And so it says, to the divine Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. And then the inscription is lost, but most scholars think that it was the dedication of a temple, perhaps a temple to the emperor, since it's dedicated to Tiberius. But that's another link, another historical link, because sometimes people will try to deny the whole historical validity of the whole account as if it's just made up. Well, at the very least, Pilate clearly was not, clearly was a real person. And so at least that can provide sort of a foothold for anybody who wants to try to deny the whole validity of this narrative. Like, this clearly was not made up. And so Jesus is taken before Pilate to be tried. There's two different candidates for where that might have happened. This is one of them. This is a reconstruction of the Antonia Fortress, which was right off the Temple Mount. And this was a Roman garrison that was probably stationed there in case of uprisings associated with the temple. Because you'll remember that that's where the Jewish revolt against the Greeks kicked off, was at the temple, when one of the Greeks thought it would be a good idea to force the high priest to offer a profane offering on their altar, and they drew their swords and said, "We're not doing that," and wound up not working out for the Greeks. So the Romans were trying to make sure that didn't happen to them, and that's probably why they built this little fort as to provide security over the Temple Mount, so that if anything did kick off, they could sweep in and put it down quickly. So some people have suggested that is likely where Jesus was tried before Pilate. I'm not so sure. It's possible, but Pilate was an important guy. He was the governor. He was practically like the king. This was a more mundane military outpost. So when the governor has some important appointment, he's not going to have it at the Air Force Base in our world. And in the same way, I'm not sure that Pilate would have held court at this fortress. I think it was more of a utilitarian military installation. But not far from there was the royal palace that had been built by Herod. And I think it's much more likely that Pilate would have taken up residence in the palace while he was in the city. Much more in keeping for a Roman of status like him. And there's not much left of the Antonia fortress. That reconstruction is largely done, largely just conjectural based on descriptions of it. But there are actually remains of Herod's palace. And so you can see where it is relative to the old city and to the Temple Mount. And there are actually still parts of the ruins that are visible just to anyone walking by. There's a sidewalk right along here. If you ever visit Jerusalem University College in Jerusalem and walk from there up to the Jaffa Gate, you'll walk right past these ruins. And so some of them are just open to the air. And then on the left shows inside this medieval fortress, which is still there near Jaffa Gate. There are more ruins of that palace that are accessible within that fortress. So this is quite possibly where Jesus was tried before Pilate. And again, kind of just a foothold to remind you that this was a real place with real people. So, as you know, Pilate found Jesus not guilty of anything that required the death penalty, but the people insisted that he be crucified. And so that brings us up to Jesus' passion and death and resurrection, which will be the topic of next week's discussion, where I'll talk about I'll talk a little bit about what archaeology tells us of crucifixion as a Roman punishment and what that would have looked like and the evidence we have for it. I'll also discuss the two possible locations of Jesus' tomb and the Hill of Calvary. And I'll talk about the different theories surrounding those two, which are Gordon's Calvary and the Garden Tomb that you see here, and then the more traditional Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's a fascinating church. And I'll give an overview of those two sites next week, and then also talk a bit about the early church and the early spread of Christianity. But that'll be next week, and so this wraps up today's talk. And now I'm happy to answer any questions. And also I have a few artifacts and souvenirs that you might want to check out. I have one of those Roman lepton coins like the widow's mite, and some ancient ceramics and a few other things. So now I'll open it up to questions. Yeah.
I've got a manufacturing question.
Okay.
Show us a picture of the shekel.
The shekel?
Word like a dime, or is that word like coin? Because they were all different shapes and all different sizes. Were they of the same denomination? Or, how does that work? Because in my head, shekel always meant a particular dime.
Yeah. So the question is about the ancient shekel, and are you just asking how ancient coinage was done?
Yeah, they all look the same, and in that picture you have behind it,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So these are the lepton coins, like the widow's mites. They're little bitty, like half the size of a dime. And I have one if you want to see it.
So
Uh,
like those shopper gloves, would they all be, buy the same stuff? They're all
yeah, they were
they
consistent.
weren't identical at all.
Well, they weren't identical because of the methods of manufacture, but they were consistent. They were roughly consistent in weight. So uh, a shekel refers to a measure of silver that comes out to something like a quarter of an ounce. So a shekel would have been about like our silver quarters that we used to use, and a half shekel would have been closer to the size of a dime. And the way they were made is that you'd have a lump of metal that would be put on like a block that would have an inscription in it, and then you'd have a hammer that would have the other side of the inscription, and you would strike the lump of metal into the block. And so you'd come out with these, what to us seem like pretty funky looking coins. They're irregularly shaped, but they were consistent in weight.
Okay, so they put it in their hand, that's how they knew what it was worth.
Yeah, and I would say it's probably likely that shopkeepers would have would have weighed coins on scales, and not just trusted the nominal weight of it, because also you had coins from all different places. There were Roman coins, but there were probably still Greek coins in circulation, and um, the the different regions had different definitions of the shekel, kind of like how multiple countries used to have a silver dollar, but they were a little bit different. So it was like that. It was much like today, where you have different denominations, and you can kind of just do mental math to figure out the conversion rate, but then in a pinch they can weigh it. And back then it was measures of precious metal, gold or silver or copper typically. So, yep.
Photo that accompanied your discussion of the room with the Last Supper may have,
Mm-hmm.
it showed some arches and columns. Is that consistent with the architecture of the time, or would that be a later elaboration?
I am not completely sure about that. So the question is, were the arches in the upper room, did they date to that time?
Yeah.
I am not an expert in Roman architecture. My specialty is more ancient architecture, like Iron Age. But I think it's possible. The Romans certainly used arches. If I saw this with no context, I would probably think medieval, like Crusader. So it's possible that it was rebuilt later, and the roof, I would guess might date to the Crusader period. But it's possible that it could date clear back to Roman times. But I am not familiar enough with Roman architecture to really say that with any confidence. Yeah, that's a great question. The question is who determines who gets to build a church on a given site? I don't actually know. I suspect that it's very complicated, because next week I'll talk about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and that church is controlled by several different Christian factions, and it has caused a lot of friction over the years. So I suspect that any church is quite complicated in who gets to build there and what they're allowed to build. But I don't really know the answer to that. Yeah. Okay, any other questions before we wrap up?